In the 80s, it seemed like everybody's mom and dad was getting divorced. Your friends, the parents on television, even at the movies, Drew Barrymore was suing her parents to get divorced from them even. And bands were not immune to this. Lead singers got divorced from their groups alarmingly often in the 80s. We had Peter Cetera take a hike from Chicago. We had David Lee Roth decide to split from the guys in Van Halen. And Roger Waters from Pink Floyd. Yes. And it even happened to this band that we're going to talk about today. Although it happened a little bit later. They were a little behind the times. They were not quite as trendy as the other groups that were splitting from their lead singers. We're here to talk today about Foreigner and the album that they released in 1991, which happened after Lou Gramm split to ostensibly pursue his solo career, ended up forming a new band of his own, but we'll get to that in a bit. Joining me as always is my esteemed co-host, Matt Wardlaw. Say hi, Matt.
Hello. Good to see you, Jeff. Good to see all the fantastic listeners, as always, even though we can't see them.
Yes, and joining us today is a special guest, friend of ours for a while now, guy that we know to have an outstanding sense of humor because we once interviewed him as if he were a completely different person. Ben Arthur, thank you for joining us.
What a pleasure. Thanks for having me back.
Before we really get started, we should talk about your podcast because you have one and it is a good
Fantastic.
one. Yes.
Thank you.
You're doing something really, really cool with your podcast. So can you tell people about it before we start talking about this record that nobody bought?
Sure. Songwriter is a podcast of stories and answer songs. So you might have Joyce Carol Oates or Roxane Gay or Cheryl Strait or Susan Orlean tell a story, and then you might have Sarah Jaffe or Mary Gauthier or Toshi Regan play a song written in response to the story. So it's kind of an exploration of inspiration. And I didn't get a chance to tell you guys when we were prepping for this, I just had the wildest interview, which was David Gilmour of Pink Floyd.
No, really?
Yeah, he's going to be on in July.
Fantastic.
Yeah, and I've been a lifelong Pink Floyd fan, so it was one of those like deeply frightening, certainly, but also surreal, fascinating. And guy was a total gentleman. The song is beautiful, and he and his wife, Polly
Sampson.
Yes, indeed, who has been writing the lyrics for most Pink Floyd songs since The Division Bell, something I somehow managed not to realize until I started doing the research for this. But it was a total joy to work with them. And then the next day I got to interview Amanda Shires and George Saunders. So,
oh man.
Yeah, really a lot of fun co-minglings of the arts. So yeah, songwriterpodcast.com.
And, David Gilmour and Amanda Shires, those are both two people that what I love about them both is they strike me that, they are both music fans, which always makes it cooler. A lot more fun when you're talking to somebody that like does what they do, but also at the same time, like they still are a fan of music. And that's pretty cool.
Absolutely. And I didn't know before I was doing my research that Gilmour has played on all kinds of records that you wouldn't necessarily know, including McCartney records. And Amanda has a master's in poetry, which I also didn't know.
I didn't know that. That's cool.
Really broad, extraordinary people. So totally fascinating.
You've got excellent taste in guests.
Yeah, incidentally, Jeff, I think it is appropriate to point out that David Gilmour, among the many records he played on, I believe, a Peter Cetera record. He's on the One More Story record somewhere, I think. So there we go. So it all ties back to Peter Cetera. That's all I'm pointing out.
Every episode, we have to talk about Peter Cetera for some reason. It's true.
I was worried because you'd already mentioned Peter Cetera in your intro, so I was worried that it was going to be weird to get it in there. But then he mentioned David, playing on so many, different records. I was like, "There's my outlet. There's my in right there." So, well, Ben, that's like such a cool thing. Like it's been Jeff and I, as you know, have been watching this like podcast of yours, like from the ground up, from the moment that you did episode 1, and it's like that has to feel pretty cool, like when it gets to the level, like when you're getting folks like that. I've really been watching the marquee of the folks that you're talking to rise, and it's just cool to see. I guess what I'm trying to say that in the shortest form is it's been cool to see the podcast develop to the point that it has.
Thanks, man. It has been really neat to have on these extraordinary people that I've admired so long. But I will say one of the things that I took away from talking to David is my personal friend
little flex moment there.
Yeah, totally. Is that, he's just a dude making his work and collaborating with his wife, who he clearly adores and admires. And I don't know, you talk to these extraordinary famous people, and the sort of difference between the work of that and the person who maybe doesn't get the stadiums full of people, it all starts to blur a little bit. Just really extraordinary artists doing their work.
How did the Gilmore thing come together?
I was interviewed on a podcast and a radio broadcast in the UK called The Monocle, which is more of a literary outlet.
It's a very British name for a podcast.
Yeah. One of my favorite words, by the way. I'm such a nerd.
Really? Why?
Absolutely. When I saw that word as a kid, I'm like, what is that? That sounds so cool.
Weirdly, my daughter also wanted a monocle for quite some time. That's the kind of kid she is. But anyway, the host of it said, oh, you need to have on my friend Polly Sampson. And I said, oh, sure, connect me. And it was only a little bit later that she was like, yeah. And her husband, David Gilmour, wrote a song in response to her most recent book. And I was like, oh, yes, no, I would have both of them on the podcast.
You should have tried to play it off like you wanted her, but not him.
That is a good idea you had.
I don't know about this David guy.
Yeah.
Never heard of him.
Listen, it's up to Polly. Whoever Polly wants to have on the show, I'm totally cool with. And, it took a couple minutes to put together, but Polly's book just came out in the US, Theater for Dreamers. And so they reached out to me and set it up. And as I say, just truly delightful, charming, kind people, and much like yourselves, just a joy to chat with and talk about art.
We're not broadcasting from a yacht. I assume that Gilmour and Polly were broadcasting from
actually, a very creaky, windy barn.
I thought everything they did was on that boat. Don't they have a floating studio someplace?
Yeah, they have that houseboat studio. That's what I thought. I was going to ask the question, but it seemed like I was like, no, I don't even need to ask. Of course they were on the boat. And so you asked the question and found out that, in fact, they were in a barn. So
a creaky, windy barn. In fact, he mentions that on the song that he wrote, Yes, I Have Ghosts, their daughter, Romany, plays a harp track that he recorded in the barn. And he says when you solo the harp track, you can hear this incredibly loud wind. And as he's speaking on the podcast, you can also hear this little wind, going by his barn where they've been broadcasting these remote shows from. So yeah, totally charming, totally sweet. Both of them very creatively engaged and interesting, nice family people. So yeah, I don't know, humbling and humble at the same time.
Maybe you guys both saw this. I forget. Was it in the New York Times? A couple of weeks ago, there was a feature about the long history of British barns being used as recording studios.
Oh, wow. No, I didn't see that.
I did not see that.
Must be something. Must be something in the UK. The acoustics in British barns are just...
I somehow missed that. And that honestly, if you were creating clickbait for me, that row of terrible articles that I would likely click on, British barns being used as recording studios is my version of teenagers who lose their tops or shark attacks or whatever. That's right up my alley.
All three very similar, by the way. Teenagers losing their tops, sharks, and barns being used as studios.
Yeah.
I am with you, Ben. I legitimately want to read that article. I almost don't want to complete this podcast because I want to read the article.
Well, let's talk about a record that was not recorded in a barn.
If we must, yeah. I got so into this barn topic that no, you're right. We should do what we've come here to do. And yeah, Jeff, well, let's do it, sir.
Yeah. So this was ostensibly a big record, right? I mean, Foreigner, I hadn't looked at the stats in a while before I checked their Wikipedia page today, but they were on a fucking tear.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Their entire discography up to this point was at least platinum. And the only record prior to this that was only platinum was the one that came out right before it. There was no reason to expect that this would be anything other than at least a medium-sized hit, but it just thunked. Nobody cared. And
it was unusual in that regard.
Many unusual things about this record. The title, the atrocious artwork, and also the fact that Lou Gramm was not singing lead.
This was one of the questions that I wanted to ask you guys, because I feel like both of you are much bigger aficionados, fans, people who know about it. Because I have a theory, but what is your opinion on what makes this album so atrocious?
I have a feeling that Matt probably likes it more than I do, because that's usually what happens.
This is correct.
My culprit here, my issue with this record is the production.
Yeah.
At that point in time, I was a fan of a lot of the acts that this producer, Terry Thomas, was working with. But even given that, I was pretty sick and tired of his sound. I mean, we've talked about, the last episode, we talked about the Cher record, her hiring these really big name marquee producers that were not hired to do their quote unquote thing. They were there to serve Cher, serve the sound, serve the song. But Terry Thomas was a guy who very distinctly had a sound. I mean, whether he was working with Bad Company or Foreigner, or I think he produced for Giant too, right? There was a list of acts that were all kind of adjacent. And I think for the most part, all his productions pretty much sound the same. There's not a lot of dynamic there. And they were trying to get away from the more ballad heavy sound that they've been associated with for the couple records leading up to this, but they went too far in the other direction with this guy. I just think it's not a long record, but it feels like one.
It does feel long. And I'll say that you and I both have had this experience where we talk to artists, even more so recently for me, where it's like you talk to artists that a lot of times when they're talking about the producer that they worked with for a record, one of the things that they'll say about that producer is, I really like how he wasn't like a lot of producers that felt like he needed to put his stamp all over the record. And that's what I hear when I listen to this record that really I don't think stuck out to me the last time that you and I looked at this record, which was, 2015, 2016 or so, when we did a feature for Ultimate Classic Rock on the anniversary at that point. This to me just sounds so much like what Terry Thomas did with Bad Company. And it's like, I loved like the Bad Company Holy Water album in particular, but it's like, this sounds more like a Brian Howe Bad Company record to me than it does a Foreigner record. And Johnny Edwards is a really good singer. And there's a couple things that he said that were interesting to me. One of which was, he said one of the things that he appreciated about Mick was that Mick didn't push him to sound like anybody. Mick just let him do his thing. And as Annie, my wife, as we were discussing this record before this podcast, she said, yeah, he's a really good singer though. So Mick really didn't have to like tell him, because he had a good singer on his hands. So be that as it may, and I think he had complimentary things to say about working with Terry as well, but it's just like, I just wonder how much influence Terry put on him to like do things a certain way, because vocally, this doesn't feel like as much of a Foreigner record. So that really stuck out to me when I was listening to the record today and this past week. Just like, there's a lot of things on this record that sound very, very Foreigner to me, but it's just like the overall treatment that's applied to it kind of takes it out of the zone that made their records so successful leading up to this. And the other thing for me was, I just don't know that the songs were there. Like that was kind of something as I was listening back today, it's just like the song quality seems to fall off pretty quickly with this record.
It's very average.
Yeah.
I'm going to say one more thing, and I'm going to toss this to Ben because I'm really curious to hear what he thinks. But for the majority of their career, we're not a keyboard averse band. They were pretty polished. They had synths, they had keys on their hits, on their records overall, but they managed to do that without being a ballad band. And then with this record, to prove that they had shifted away from stuff like I Don't Want to Live Without You or whatever.
Yeah,
they just threw all that shit out the window. I think there are only 2 or 3 songs on this album where you can even hear keyboards. It's just all these grinding guitars and screaming. Anyway, Ben, what do you think?
So it's amazing that you all each hit one of my 2 premises of the things that are wrong with this album unerringly. One, the songs are really, really wretched. I'll circle back to that in 1 second. And the other thing, and I'd like to actually talk to you guys more about this because I'm really curious as deep music thinkers and critics, like what you think about this. I think there is more than a little tinge of toxic masculinity.
Yes.
And the issue that is central to rock and roll bands, and especially during this time period of, I am going to make up for the fact that I am singing about emotions by trying to like cover it up in like screaming guitar solos and whatever bravado. But actually, as far as the songs, I actually put together a game if you all are interested in playing.
Yes, absolutely.
Would you say that you all have memorized all of the lyrics to this album?
No, I would not.
I would say that I have not memorized all the lyrics to this record, but I'm curious. I will play this game just to see if you chose some of the lyrics that I zeroed on today for discussion here on this very podcast, because
excellent. Well, let us
when we think of cancel culture, there were a few spots on this album that I was like, oh, Mick, that's problematic here in 2021.
Problematic, but also just so shockingly predictable. Like if you did the magnetic word art of rock songs, most times you can easily guess. So let us try this, Jeff. You were up first. In Only Heaven Knows, I am going to say the first 3 lines of a verse, and then you are going to fill in either maybe from memory, but I'm guessing just because it is so shockingly obvious what the dumbest, worst lyricist put in there. Okay, are you ready? In this game of hit and miss, how long can we
go on like this?
Nailed it.
Oh my God.
Yes.
Okay. Matt, you're up next. This is the same song. Why do we laugh? Why do we cry? Why do we feel
as if we're going to die?
So close. I'm sorry, sir. Jeff, this bounces it back to you. Would you like to take the point from?
I'm thinking the rhyme's got to be cry instead of die. Something about.
Let me give you the verse again, because we're rhyming with cry. Why do we laugh?
Sorry.
Why do we cry? Why do we feel?
Well, if it doesn't cry, maybe it's fly.
Why do we feel? What do we feel?
I don't know. You give it to me. What is it?
This pain inside.
Oh, God. See, I was giving them too much credit. I was looking for the clean rhyme.
See, I think that is exactly your mistake. Would you like to go for another round?
Sure, let's do it.
Okay, this is from Ready for the Rain. Jeff, I believe you're up. I don't know what's in the future. No one can say. Don't want to think about the past. I've got to
go my own way, probably something like that.
Oh, I am sorry, sir. You have lost the point. Matt, would you like to take the point?
All right, let's run through the section again and I'll take a crack.
I don't know what's in the future. No one can say. Don't want to think about the past. I've got to
play.
Oh, come on.
Got to live for today. He's got to live for today.
Sir. Yes, sir.
Yes.
Wow, this game is so exciting. You never would have guessed. It bounces back and forth. All right, last one. Matt, this is from Mountain of Love. There is no use in pretending because I've got my eyes on you. The first time I saw you, girl, I knew nobody else
could screw. I don't have this one, Ben.
Jeff, what do you got?
Would do.
Yes, sir.
Oh,
yes,
my
sir.
God.
Wow,
really?
Jeff, you are good at this game. That is impressive.
Shut the door.
What I want to say, I really want to get into, I've been looking forward to getting into the mechanics of these songs with you because I know a lot of time thinking about this stuff. But I just want to say, you brought up something that's very interesting to me about these lyrics. I think there is a particular vein of thoroughly boneheaded rock and roll lyrics that was kind of dominant around this period of time. You know, there were a lot of songs about meeting in the parking lot. There were a lot of songs about like, you've broken my heart. So now I'm going to go out there and I'm going to meet this city head on. And, you know, a lot of shit like that. So I'm glad you brought it up. I'm glad you pointed it out. And I want to hear you break down these songs, you know, from a theory standpoint, because I feel like that is not my strong point at all, but I don't think you have to have that be your strong point to hear this stuff and not think this is real meat and potatoes, like A plus B equals C stuff. You know, I feel like.
But boy, you just went like what Ben already did, like going beyond meat and potatoes and, you know, standard lyrics at the time. Like he just pointed out, and I would not have noticed this, but like certainly the 3 that you got, like painfully basic, like these are songs that like I could have written these songs, as it turns out. Like, you know, if I just would have gone for the most basic answer, I would have gone, you know, 3 for 3 as you did, Jeff. Like, I mean, the fact that like literally they just chiseled in those for the final lines in each case is like unbelievable when you consider the caliber. So Ben, you exposed a very important flaw in this record, because just like up until this point, I think as a songwriter, Mick was pretty bulletproof. And it's like, you're like knocking some big holes in like what's here on this record, like exposing some big problems.
What was striking to me was I wouldn't necessarily have said, oh, Foreigner had some really interesting songs. prior to this album. But listening back, especially when you touch on the giant hits, they're really interesting ideas lyrically. Feels like the first time, has a like a Virgin vibe, like as far as a lyrical conceit. That's an interesting thing for like a hard rock band to say. I want to know what love is a weird and kind of interesting thing for a rock band to say. Cold as ice, like a simple idea, but actually interesting conceits. And the production is also much more interesting. Like it's just not this cut and paste BS years before cut and paste existed. And that was, it was striking to me that I did not notice how interesting those songs, and especially the lyrical construction of the ideas within the song, were actually pretty surprising in their own way. And then you put that up against this stuff, and it's really just like middle of the road pap. And I honestly, it's kind of surprising that they were so thoroughly punished, because I feel like when a band hits that kind of level, it's actually kind of hard to get beat down quite so brutally as this. What do you attribute that to?
Well, that's what we're here to talk about, man. I mean, I've read quotes from Mick kind of pinning this on grunge, which is bullshit, because that was not even a glimmer in anybody's eye at this point. It had been a little while since they'd put out a record. It had been 4 years, but even then, I don't think you could really hang it on that either. Rock radio embraced Low Down and Dirty.
Yeah. Good song. Good single.
Still holds up.
I knew I was stumbling right into that, but no, like that's what stuck out to me listening to this record is just like Low Down and Dirty, like, good solid single for rock radio. And Edwards had the pipes that if the songs would have been there, I think that they would have had a much better shot of pulling this off and having this be more of a long-term thing.
He did have the pipes. He is a good singer.
And technically the album is flawless. Like there's nothing about the performances that are not entirely credible and
competent. It's utterly competent. Yeah. Low Down and Dirty is a real prime offender. If we're talking about these lyrics on this record, I think I've never listened too closely to this song, but I feel like the gist is you've hurt me, so now I'm going to go out and have sex with anybody I can get my hands on.
Yeah. 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 And when I look at Moment of Truth, which was the other one that stuck out, I intend to treat you like a woman because I can see you're not a child. So, yeah, there's
good.
As long as he's looking at her ID. Yes, that's good.
Yeah. My Low Down and Dirty one was the distance you've been keeping grows wider every day. Time is running out. There's nothing left to say. And Moment of Truth, the one that really made me want to throw up in my mouth was, now I don't want to love forever. I don't need a master plan. I just want to come together, and I want you to understand.
Oh,
like that's really, there's nothing there. As far as an interesting idea to write a song about, that is like, it's vanilla ice cream that's melted, like there's nothing there.
Yeah. So I don't know what I would chalk it up to. I mean, we've talked in the past about some records that may have benefited from different timing. But this is the summer of 1991. The world is still Foreigners as far as we know. It's a summertime record. It's got a leadoff single that, at least theoretically gives Foreigner fans what they've been missing from Foreigner for at least the last album, minus Lou Gramm. But, Johnny Edwards doesn't sound that different from Lou Gramm. He's clearly a different guy, but even if he's not a sound-alike singer, he's not that different.
He's so close that to the average person that's not you or I or Ben, like much like it is today when folks will go to see Foreigner and realize that they won't realize that Lou's not even there. Like your average music fan would have heard this in 1991, been like, cool, Foreigner, I dig it. And that's where it would have stopped.
Or to take a Pink Floyd reference, relatively few people necessarily know that Have a Cigar is not sung by a member of Pink Floyd.
Oh, yeah.
It's just a different voice.
I was floored by that when I found it out.
Other than the really seriously atrocious cover art.
I don't mind it, by the way. I don't mind the cover art.
It's hideous. Every other album that they'd released up to that point had a really decent, if not outright clever cover, but this is just it looks like somebody threw up. It's terrible.
Do we think that was done on some sort of early like computer technology? I'm really upset that I didn't ask about like how the cover art was created, because like I would have loved to have heard that 1991 story of like, oh man, we worked really hard on that.
So what do you, Matt, what would you chalk this up to?
Chalk it up to like why it didn't happen?
Not only why it didn't happen, but the gulf between what the baseline for success for them was prior to this and how this one did. I mean, it's just enormous. Like, and it's not even like, we talked about David Lee Roth falling off a cliff with A Little Late Enough, but his solo career was not that far along. Foreigner had been around for quite a while. And
yeah, sure. Literally every record had been successful up to this one. And there had been even Inside Information, which was the record prior to this one, okay, if there were parts of it that did a little bit less well, they still had a number of singles that did, really well on that record. So you're right. Like this is one where basically they are beyond being well established. There's been no sign of trouble other than the fact that I think that obviously Lou leaves at some point prior to Inside Information, comes back, they do Inside Information. So yeah, there was a little bit of interband turmoil leading up to that record, but it's like to the person that was buying Foreigner records that didn't know any of that, like you really had no sign of trouble prior to now, where it's like, okay, Lou Graham's left the band, if you know that. And then when you hear this record, you're like, okay, this doesn't sound like the previous, Foreigner records that I've owned. So, but as far as why it fell off, I go back to like what Ben said, like you can't fault like any way about like the way this record was put together, because like you can tell that they worked on every inch of the record. So it's not like they put out shoddy product.
What did Johnny say? They worked on it for 8 months.
8 months. Yeah. Yeah. And he said that like basically he learned how they had kind of gotten the vocal performances that they did, because he's like, Terry had me record the vocals in sections, so they went over every piece. I will say that like I do think that they're again with the heavy-handed Terry Thomas influence, like I don't think the guitars on this record sound as much like Mick Jones. Like they're not as instantly identifiable, which is what I've always loved about his work on records. Is like you hear a Foreigner song, it's like like Mick's one of those guys, much like a Mark Knopfler or anybody that you want to point to, that has just that tone that's instantly identifiable. And I think that's one thing that for me is missing from this record. So if I was sitting at a party and somebody had this record on, I don't think that I would go, oh my God, is that the new Foreigner record? Like I've been wondering what's up with those guys. So I think that might have been part of it, is that like the sound revision on this record might have taken away some of the ears that would have been drawn in otherwise hearing this, wherever they're going to hear it. I just don't know that organically that this record was going to find its way to Foreigner fans as naturally as it might have in the past.
Did you buy it when it came out?
I did not buy it when it came out. No, I was pretty upset when I found out that Lou had left the band, and I heard the single, and it's like, even you're very right. The single is very much Foreigner, but there still was just like, I think I was still mad enough that I was like, all right, that, I had to admit to myself that does sound like Foreigner, but I was still pissed enough not to buy the record. What about you?
I reviewed it. So the label sent it to me. I didn't have to buy it. There are a couple tracks that I liked. In coming back to the album this week, I still like.
Yeah.
Not from a lyrical standpoint, but I think Ready for the Rain and Mountain of Love are both two of the more interesting tracks, at least melodically. It's just, by the time I got to the end of that album, I felt like I had just been assaulted. Like I was just tired of it. It's kind of like, I know I was a fan of that incarnation of Bad Company, but
yep, I was
that
too.
Holy Water record is, what is that, 15 songs long? And it feels like 30. There's just something about that Terry Thomas sound that wears you out.
Definite fatigue for sure.
Yes.
That's another reason it's surprising that I did not like this record is as I already said, like I loved the Holy Water record. So on paper, if I would have known that Terry Thomas, I was enough of a liner notes geek that if I would have known that Terry Thomas was associated, I would have been like, all right, I'll give these guys the benefit of the doubt. I love Foreigner, not happy about Lou Gramm, but you know what? Terry Thomas, I'm impressed enough. Let me get this a go. But you're right. I mean, in retrospect, listening to both of those records, fatigue sets in long before you're at the end of the album. By the way, this record, it's longer than you would think. It's 51 minutes, which at the time that was already long for a record. But you're right. This feels like 90.
And it's only 10, 11 songs? It doesn't have a lot of tracks on it.
I do wonder too, like I'd love to circle around to the toxic masculinity at some point, but a thought occurs to me. One of the secrets, I think, of success of a lot of bands is strife. Is at least two people in the band kind of hating each other and disagreeing vehemently. And that process is really uncomfortable, but it actually makes you make better things. And that's, someone was saying about diversity, like people in companies that are not diverse report being much happier because they don't get challenged on whatever their racist bullshit is. But the sales targets, like every measure of a company is worse if they don't go through the necessary process of being challenged, which is why I'm here to tell you both you're wrong.
Fantastic.
I'm trying to bring your art form just a little higher. No, seriously. So like McCartney and Lennon, of course, Roger Waters and David Gilmour, I think the reason they break up is also, I think, the reason they do extraordinary things. And
can we name a single creative partnership that like the band was improved after that strife ended? After
Ike and Tina Turner.
That's unfair.
You make a really good point, though, Ben. I mean,
if you're an Ike Turner apologist, I mean, just say so, Jeff.
I mean, you make a really good point, though, that the strife between Jones and Graham, like I do think that was a very important ingredient. I know that I've talked to one or both of them, or just even read stuff that like at a certain point, Lou wanted a bigger piece of it. And that's another thing that happens with bands is when you see the creative dynamic start to shift one way or another after one guy, in this case, Mick Jones, has been the dominant one for a long time. So it's like we see that a lot with bands where it's like the singer, after he has a few hit singles or has a few co-writes on a few things, particularly if they have a few co-writes on a few things, that's when they feel like they can start to flex their muscle more, because it's like, you know what? I know that I can have more of a voice in this because I wrote the last, 3 out of the 4 hit singles that we had or whatever. So I think that was definitely a dynamic that was in play with Jones and Graham. So you do take a very important piece away by removing that, because Jeff and I, and certainly you've been as well, like we've all heard stories or seen something where it's just like you tell somebody that they can't do something, or you tell somebody that guitar thing isn't quite where it needs to be. Like particularly like when you're in a band situation, that makes somebody mad enough that like we've heard the story where it's just like they came up with that solo. We talked to Kenny Aronoff at one point. And it's like he was basically going to get his walking papers from John Mellencamp, and he walked in and he was like so freaked out and or mad, like he played that certain part for Jack and Diane that becomes the legendary thing that he keeps his gig. So Graham Nash is another one that I think of. Or
Johnny Greenwood getting mad during the recording of Creep, and that like is him having a bit. Like, yeah, that's him having a little stomping his foot with his guitar, and they kept it.
That's fantastic. One of the favorite stories I love is Graham Nash, like, being, told, we got 15 minutes and I bet you can't write a song. And so he turns around and writes the song that ends up being called Just a Song Before I Go. Like that is like one of the better FUs in rock and roll that I've ever seen.
What's hilarious to me about this particular breakup is that the narrative now is that Lou was tired of ballads. Lou wanted to be more of a rock band. Mick told him to fuck off. And so he left to pursue his solo career, at which point Foreigner makes the hardest album they've arguably ever made. And Lou starts another band.
Well, but I wonder whether that's not a product, like whether what we're hearing is not self-consciousness and an attempt to, so there you to Lou from Mid, which so many attempts to show someone just ends up, you're not writing it for it to be the great song. You're trying to make a point, and it's audible. So speaking of which, like, what do you guys make of this? Because listening back to music from this period, I find it really striking that there seems to be sort of the musical equivalent of truck nuts in a lot of songs, in a lot of bands, like an attempt to both make these songs, which are emotionally straightforward, are talking about pain, sadness, heartbreak, etc., and trying to cover that up with the most ridiculous bravado.
maybe this is the distinction here, and maybe this is why it falls flat on this album. I think that you tended to hear it more from younger artists. I'll compare it to another album that came out around the same time, Bone Against Steel by 38 Special. There's some of that bravado on there, but there are other songs that make it clear that the protagonist is somebody who's been around the block and they're a little beaten up. There's a song on that 38 Special record, Matt's going to know what I'm talking about, called Signs of Love. And there's a line in that song that I think, I'm overselling it before I give it to you, but I think, in the context of what this type of music is very striking. He talks about feeling high, and then he says, I don't get high anymore, not till you come through the door. And I just think there's a whole lifetime in that line, saying, I used to do this other stuff. I've given it up, and now I feel like I'm young again because you're here. And again, I'm overselling it quite a bit, but it's not the same thing as the type of shit that you're hearing on this Foreigner record. It is vulnerable. And I think artists of that peer group were capable of expressing that type of emotion. I mean, you even heard that type of stuff on certain Van Halen songs of the era. You got Pound Cake, which is about as clunk-headed as any song that came out that year, but there were other things that were part of that, their emotional vocabulary. And you don't hear that at all on this Foreigner record. It's much more in line with something that you would expect to hear from Poison.
Yeah. And, something else that I think of as you're talking about all that is that, that's the disconnection here, is that you have, first of all, it's very impressive. And I expressed this to Johnny, but it's impressive that Mick brought Johnny into the writing process. But I think that in some form, one of the things that is missing from this record is that you don't have a couple of writing partners on this record. You have basically Mick on his own, collaborating with these people that he really hasn't worked with. And it's just I think you can, what you were just saying about the 38 Special, you were talking about kind of the evolution of a band and their writing in a sense. And I think that kind of snaps off clean when you break up the writing partnership that had things, rolling up until the Inside Information record. So I think that's another thing that's, missing from this album, is the fact that there was no connection behind the scenes. Mick was really, working with an entire new group of collaborators, which can sometimes bring in fresh things and new ideas. I don't think that really happened here.
And kind of the tragedy is that with I Want to Know What Love Is, which is not a song that I enjoy and never have, but it's almost the equivalent. It's like the meat and potatoes rock equivalent of Brian Wilson putting his heart on his sleeve in the mid 60s, making it okay for rock singers to kind of cry on record. Foreigner sort of did that with I Want to Know What Love Is. That is the most emotionally naked ballad of its era from a rock band. And then to go from that to Low Down and Dirty, it's sad. It's very sad.
Foreigner, to this day, when I hear I Want to Know What Love Is, that, there are still certain parts of that song that hit me, that it's just a very emotional song. It's just and they captured something very, I think, special with that record. And even the next record, Inside Information, a song like I Don't Want to Live Without You, as a kid that was listening to that, it's I believed in Lou Gramm at that point. I could feel the pain of what he was going through. That's completely absent from this record. There's nothing on this record that I grabbed onto in that way, where it's I was sitting there, even though I'm a kid, I'm going, yeah, Lou, I totally get what you're talking about. I didn't know what he was talking about, but at the time I felt like I knew what Lou was going through. And I didn't have that kind of connection with anything on this record.
I think one of the things you're describing there, being a kid and not really understanding what someone's talking about, yet we are machines for perceiving, or so, whether we're right or not, but perceiving authenticity. And I think a primary way in which music is understood and either accepted or rejected is our human calculus as to whether the person is authentically saying something that they feel, or whether they're just handing us a pile of refrigerator magnet art. That, I think, may be one of the secrets here, is that there's nothing in here that feels authentically real. And I think surprise is part of that. How comedy is supposed to be really about surprise, hearing something you don't expect to hear. Music is like that too. We want to hear that next beat where we expect it to be. But if there's nothing in there that doesn't get us surprised, doesn't make us take a stutter step, it's very hard to break through into something that is compelling.
The Foreigner records and like Survivor albums, like the couple records that they did with Jimmy Jamison in particular, When Seconds Count and Vital Signs, these were records that like I was able to submerge myself in, that really kind of spoke to the things that I was like feeling. And it wasn't going to be until years later that I really, really realized like how powerful it is. And it's not just, we see this, and I mean, certainly Ben, you would see this, like you come to realize, I think, that like not any songwriter has the power necessarily, unless, and you might disagree. Does any songwriter have the power to like connect like that? That's a special thing, isn't it?
I think anybody can do that. I think it takes, like all art, it takes a lifetime to get good at it. And there are these weird prodigies that happen. And there are these weird happenstances where someone just happens to get a great idea. But at the end of the day, see, this is one of my hobby horses that I get upset about. And now you triggered me, and you're going to have to hear it.
I'm here for it, Ben.
I strongly feel that we, especially as Americans, but across the board, misassociate music with capitalism, with money, and we misassociate the making of music with being good or bad, whether it is commercially viable. And it is, to me, the metaphor that I always use is it's like doing yoga because you want really ripped abs. Like you are missing the point of what you're doing by focusing on the wrong part of it, and you are going to inevitably do it wrong because you aren't thinking about the actual ends. We need to understand music and songwriting as something that we do to alleviate our own suffering and to reach out to other people to try to alleviate their suffering. And we need to let go of the idea that only special people can do this, because it's just not true. It's so weird to me. I get mad about this. Now I'm ranting. I get mad about the fact that songwriting is not a core art. Like, why do we teach painting? Why does every university across this country have a freaking poetry program and a theater program and a playwriting program when those arts are minuscule, relatively speaking, to the juggernaut that is songwriting, at least commercially speaking, and culturally speaking too. Yet somehow we put it in this magical category, and it doesn't need to be. You don't need to play an instrument. You don't need to have special skills. It is a thing that we do to make ourselves feel better, to connect to each other, and it is not magic. So, end rant.
No, I want to continue this rant, because part of what we've kind of sussed out about the way the format imploded in the early 90s is that everything kind of sounded like everything else. But the implosion of this format seemed to happen very quickly. And so I wonder, why are the hits at AOR in the period leading up to this moment, why are they resonating? Is it because they're not product? I mean, do you feel like the biggest hit songs of that era were demonstrably better than something like Unusual Heat? Or people just so kind of accustomed to being fed product that that's all they were looking for? If that's the case, then what were Mick Jones's options in 1990 when he set about to make this record?
I think that's what I appreciate in retrospect about Foreigner, is that they could craft songs that could be perceived as product, but I believe that they came from a real place. And because those guys, because Mick started out, like the first Foreigner album, 1977 or whatever, had a bunch of blockbuster hits. Okay, they had a bunch of blockbuster hits on that first record, but it's like they started out as like songwriters, like looking for some, form of success, hoping for some form of success. So they were writing songs that, came from a real place to begin with. And it's not like suddenly once they had that big hit record, they're like, all right, now let's write the Double Vision record, and let's write the Head Games record, and let's write the, 4 record. And they all have to be songs like this. It's like now they had like, perhaps somewhat of an idea of the type of songs that they needed to write that would bring that kind of success. But still, I think that they were still writing in a way that felt true to them without kind of just selling their soul to get what, like, I guess what I'm trying to say here is that they knew what they could do from a craft standpoint to get where they needed to get to. But at the end of the day, it's like they still remain quality songwriters. I look at even like you mentioned Poison. I think Something to Believe In is a song that like came from a very real place, and that's why it like connected with folks. So I think that's what you had a lot of in that era, even with the records that were quote unquote hits and or products, was you had songs that like were able to connect in a certain emotional way. And I think that there's a big talent to that. So the thing that I think that's different about Foreigner, which again, I think it just comes back to like the songs just weren't there on this particular record. But one of the things that I always appreciated about Foreigner was that there are some bands that you hear them get to a point where you can tell that they're just writing for the radio. And I don't feel like that ever really happened with Foreigner. And I know that there's people out there listening to this that will completely disagree with that, but it's just like, I think that even, by the time you get to like, say, after the monster success of 4, when you get to like, say, Agent Provocateur and Inside Information, like I still think at the end of the day, like that Mick and Lou were focused on some level in writing songs that they could live with as songwriters and artists. I don't think that they would just write a song and throw it out there just to get another number one record. So I think that they did still stay true in some form to their artistic muse.
So to try to answer your question, Jeff, I feel like you have to disaggregate art and commerce. And I think on the art side, everyone likes different stuff. And this could have been the truest, most open-hearted, genuine effort to write the best songs that they could at that moment. And moreover, there may be people who this album is the perfect album for, and they're not wrong. It's the art that is for them. Like one of the things I think we have to understand and accept as art fans is that when you don't like something, that thing is not for you. That thing is for someone else, and it's no less legitimate because you don't like it and it's not for you than if they don't like the things that you like. And then you talk about the commercial side, and the commercial side gets really squiggly. You have to keep in mind that there were massive corporations that were making decisions about who had the budget and who didn't have the budget, and who was getting the payola and who wasn't getting the payola, and whether there was an A&R guy who disappeared or didn't disappear. And I think we have to separate the idea that a thing was a hit and therefore it's good, or a thing wasn't a hit and therefore it's bad. And I actually, one of my favorite songs to sort of talk about around this issue, have you ever heard It Couldn't Be Done by Tim Finn?
No, I'm surprised because I'm a big Finn aficionado.
Well,
it's the Brothers Finn. I'll have to look that one up.
Please do. Listen to that song and tell me it is not delightful and everything that you would want from what you would think of as a rock and roll hit song. It's just a great tune. It's funny. It's interesting. It is upbeat and cheerful while having this dark, frustrated center. It is great. It didn't get whatever it was that would have, I think, made it into a giant hit in another moment in time. If he were 20 years younger and 10 pounds lighter, or whatever the commercial necessities for someone to invest the money to make that into a hit. But you think about it, it's like a company. Like if there's a startup and they're selling a couple items a week from their website and they suddenly get millions of dollars worth of advertising money, they may be able to bring it to that next level. They may not. And what is fashionable at that moment and weird things about timing that we can't even understand. But at the end of the day, we have to remove the idea that because something is not a hit, that means ergo it's shitty. Like some of the weirdest art out there is some of my favorite art. That song, I listen to that song all the time. Christian Hudson, there's a song of his called 1, 2, 3 that I just think is Kristen Lee Hudson. It's just a freaking great song. My kids sing along to that song because it's like one of those weird songs. Maya Sharp's Me Without You is like an amazing hit song. And I love that song so much. No one ever heard it at the radio, but it doesn't mean it's not a freaking great song.
One for me is Robert Bradley's Postcard by David Mead, I think.
Ooh, I'm adding that to my list.
It came out in 1999. I'm still pissed off that it wasn't a hit. There's no reason that it shouldn't have been. But
and David Mead is a funny, I think he's a funny example of that. Like, he had the deal at BMG. He had a lot of big believers. Clyde Lieberman, back in the day, who was the head of BMG Publishing, loved David Mead. And I remember my friend Vienna Tang got a message from him that he wanted to do a tour with her. And she was like really excited because, like you, she was a big David Mead fan. And she was shocked when her agent said, "Oh yeah, he wants to open for you." And she's like, "No, this guy's David Mead." And, it's just one of those things. I don't know what happened. It doesn't mean that his art isn't amazing, right, and that song isn't breathtaking.
Yeah, I agree with you completely. And I also hate the inverse argument, which is that if it sold 8 million records, then it must be great. Like, fuck off.
Yeah, agreed. Absolutely.
Well, but like it feels to me that those two things are patently obvious, and yet it also feels to me like somehow we hold a little weird belief that, in the sort of, I don't know, metaphysical bootstraps of art to get to its level. And it just doesn't happen enough times that I think you have to accept that whatever happens, sometimes the TikTok algorithm gets tickled by a guy farting in the face of his wife, and it gets millions of views. And, whatever dumb thing that I put up to try to get someone to listen to my songs gets 500. It doesn't mean that, the guy farting in his wife's face is better than the thing that I'm doing, but I can't control it.
Those are absolute truths, but they're also very difficult to internalize. And I think for a band in Foreigner's position, it's so difficult to thread that needle between understanding what the audience is looking for and maintaining what you want to do, or even like still being able to connect to what you want to do as a writer, knowing that there's all this other stuff around you. Like, that's a devil's bargain that you strike whenever you put anything out there. And God, if it says it sells 7 million records, I don't know what I would do. I can't imagine that kind of not pressure necessarily, but I just feel like you cannot help but be thrown off your axis a little bit creatively simply by the introduction of an audience. And when you scale up the audience to the extent that Foreigner had, the run that they had was remarkable.
There's nothing more common than people not knowing that what they've just written or recorded is this extraordinary thing, different than all of the other times they tried. I've clearly been on a Pink Floyd kick, but I was listening to an interview with the woman who sings that vocal solo on Dark Side of the Moon. And she had no idea that they were going to even use it. She actually thought they were going to throw it away because they just sort of like nodded and were like, "Thanks." And then she left. And she was as surprised as anyone when it turned out that, she's a major focal point of that album.
I would say that, like, for 1 time out of 10, you'll have somebody that says, like, "Yeah, we knew we were going to have a big hit record with this record." But it's just like, it's still just unbelievable to me as a music fan. Like, when you hear so many of these records that were just giant hit records, if you talk to the artists, there's a lot of them that will tell you, "Yeah, we had no idea." Like, so it's just like, that's a cool feeling, like, to have the success that you have with a huge song. I think that speaks to the kind of person they are as an artist or as a songwriter, that even if because a lot of times these are people that have had hit records. And so when you talk to somebody that like has had hit records, that they still aren't jaded in a way that like, "Oh yeah, I knew that was going to be a hit record." Like, that to me speaks to like how committed they were to their actual just like writing songs and what they love to do. I wasn't even going to say art, but it's just like, that was nowhere in the thought process. They were just doing what they love to do, and something really cool came out of it. And that's always really cool to me to like, see people that are just thinking organically and naturally.
Paul McCartney offered yesterday to another artist.
Right.
Bruce Springsteen wrote Hungry Heart for the Ramones. Like, it is very common that people do these extraordinary things that have these places in our culture that seem undeniable now, but at the time were not perceptible as the thing that they became.
Yeah, 100%. 100%, Ben Arthur.
I want to ask you something kind of personal as a songwriter and a recording artist.
Excellent.
Well, what was your personal journey learning how to disassociate the creation of the art from the expectation of how it would be received?
Elaborate a little bit on what you mean by that, because I'm not sure I get what you're asking.
Well, I can only assume that when you put out your first album, you had a lot of hopes tied up into that, in terms of who would hear it, how many people would hear it, how they'd respond to it. I can only assume that you were, at least to some extent, like disabused of that notion. You kind of have to be in order to continue making art. And so I wonder for you, obviously we're with Mick Jones, like he's fine. He doesn't need to do anything else for the rest of his life. He's going to be fine. But we're still talking about the same type of phenomenon. Just, I want to know for you what it was like as a novice recording artist to put out your first record and then to kind of hold your breath and wait for the world to respond and then to process the way, the response that you did get.
Yeah, I think the conversation we're having is really a reflection of me still processing how to understand that thing that happens and your essential powerlessness to control what the world does and doesn't do, the shits that the world doesn't give for the most part, but then occasionally does. And I remember my second record was put out on a label, and some dickhole somewhere wrote a review and said something like, I can tell right away that Ben Arthur's first single is going to be this, and the second single is going to be that, and then the third one is going to be the ballad, and that's when frat boys will all be swaying along, and sort of laid out this future for me of all of these things, inevitably happening. And I remember sort of reading that and feeling both a desire to choke the guy to death and to beat him with his laptop keyboard, but also hoping that he was right. He wasn't.
Right.
But you just have to do your work and get it out there as best you can. And like what we're talking about, like doing yoga for the cut abs is the first type of thinking, that I'm going to write a song and it's going to make money and people are going to like me and pretty girls will clap. And then the other type of thinking is I'm actually no different than David Gilmour in his cookie barn. He's working on his weird art projects. I'm working on my weird art projects. It is such a privilege. Like, it's funny. I talked to a friend of mine who's a writer, and he had a couple books out on Random House and sold, however many books, not tons, but sold some books. And he was asking me how many people listen to my songs in a week. And like, really, like if you can go on my, well, unfortunately, you get reports now every week. Spotify and Apple and Pandora all send you this information, which you can ignore, I guess, but it's kind of hard not to look at it. And the numbers are very, very sad relative to like Lil Nas X or whomever else. Terrible. 500 people might listen to my songs on Pandora and like 50 people might listen to my songs on Spotify. And he was saying, so I was saying, yeah, it's really not much. And by the way, what that's worth in dollars is like pennies, like literal pennies. And I was saying how, it is frustrating. And he said, man, if there was a week when 1,000 people read one of my stories, that would be the best week of my life.
Yeah.
And that is true.
Yeah.
Like that's true and extraordinary.
Okay, so look, here's an example. I think your song So Far,
yes,
that for me is a song that could have been, should have been a hit. Beautiful song. Gives me chills. I love
it. Thank you.
If 1 million people if that song went viral, do you want that kind of, like, there's something that comes along with that type of attention. Would that really be, maybe that'd be the best week of your life, but the weeks that came after that, you don't know what's going to happen.
No. I would like to stay very poor and unknown and cool. I would like only just the coolest guys recording podcasts in their dining rooms to know about me. I would know if someone handed me the check that I would get from Spotify, I wouldn't even cash it, Jeff. I would be like, no.
And meanwhile,
all right, I got it.
No, I don't want the screaming fans and the money and the opportunity to have sex with underage women. No, thank you.
But do you get what I'm saying? There's something that goes along with that.
There is, I'm sure, and I think it would probably be. I think it has been super dangerous for any number of young kids who just happen to tickle the algorithm, either the radio algorithm or now the computer algorithm. I think it's probably incredibly poisonous. But at the end of the day, you are trying to make work that touches people. And there is this incredibly challenging balance, and something that I literally work on every day between I am making this stuff because I feel better at the end of the day when I make this stuff, and the sense that, I hope somebody out there hears this. And I would like that number of people to be more than just however many people it is. But at the end of the day, I'm also super grateful that I get to be heard. Excuse me, my dog would like to say some things. Your dog's going to probably.
Your dog is also grateful that it's being heard.
Yeah, I think that's an important thing, Ben, and touches on something you said earlier. You feel better at the end of the day for making the stuff that you do. And I think that's what I respect about some of my favorite songwriters, in this case, Lou Gramm, Mick Jones, Frankie Sullivan, Jim Peterick. They were just, in a sense, no matter what happened with these songs and these singles, however they performed, like they were doing the work. They were like literally making the things because at the end of the day, it made them happy to write with Mick, Sammy Hagar, write with Eddie Van Halen. Like they felt really good when they came up with something that like made them happy, where it's just like, we did something really good together, regardless of how it was going to perform. Like now, I think that each of these guys had gotten to a place where it's like they had a good sense of like, Sammy gets, finish what you started, like, which I think the story on that, Jeff, is that like he comes up with this thing, wakes up Eddie, you got to hear this.
I thought Eddie woke him up. That isn't the idea. The story is that he was having sex with his wife and Eddie woke him up.
That's right. Eddie woke Sammy up. But it's just like, I just love the idea.
That's where the title came from.
That they still would get so excited about creating something together that like Eddie hears that and he's like, man, I got to go wake up my buddies so we can like finish this one off. Like the tangible enthusiasm that just linked certain people together in that era, which still exists. Like I've always loved that. I some of my favorite songwriters, and these are not, good examples because we're talking about people that have like written multi-platinum hit records, but some of my favorite songwriters, are the ones that just like write because like it makes them feel better at the end of the day. And it's like, and they're writing because that's what they want to do. And that's what they feel like they have to do. And I think that like the average person, if they hear somebody say like, well, it's what I have to do, they're like, you shouldn't have to do that. But at the same point, like if you're talking to a certain songwriter, you know what they're talking about because it's like, it's their vision that like they've been put there to like write the songs and it's just what they do. So I love people that are just creating because it makes them feel good. That's at the core of it. Like that's such a cool thing.
Maybe the perfect solution is that you can be a successful artist, but you don't get to know about it for like 5 to 10 years.
Yes.
No. So I think there's also a weird hangover that we're still experiencing from the era that we're talking about, where suddenly musicians were awash in money. And it became normative to be like, oh, hey, I write songs and also I've got a Learjet. And that's like a historical anomaly. That has not happened. Like, there are a couple of people who have made that kind of money from music over the centuries, not very many. Like, and we still have this dumb idea that, if you make songs, man, your goal should be making bajillions of dollars. And if you're the dude who makes clay pots, or you're the lady who paints on cardboard or whatever, like no one necessarily is like, oh, in order for me to respect what you do, you would not believe, Jeff, the number of people who literally ask me how much money I make. Like you just meet them at a party and they essentially like,
oh, yeah.
How much money do you make? Like, and like, they don't say it directly at first, but if you don't answer, they'll keep poking at you. And essentially what they're saying, I think, is I do not have my normal way of judging you and putting you into a socioeconomic category. And it makes me uncomfortable because I don't know whether you're, like a Robert Plant Learjet guy or whether you're, a dumb Ben Arthur guy. And it is fine to not know that. And it is fine to respect the woman making her paintings. And
it's appropriate to not know that.
It is to me, but you bring up a sort of societal hang up we have around money and around understanding art as a thing that is not legitimate unless it is economically feasible. We know that's BS, and yet we hold on to it. And so to answer your question in full, I am working towards the place where I make the work that I make because I want to make it. And I do my best to sort of share it out there because I would like it to hopefully touch some people and to ease their suffering in the way that it eases my suffering. But I am working towards the place where that's it. And like that nothing else I don't allow myself to put other weight on me because it's not healthy.
That's the zen of creation. I think it's very difficult to maintain, but I mean,
it's pretty much impossible. Like, this podcast, like, I'm sure you can look up somewhere how many people listen. What is the number?
I try not to.
Yeah.
It's emailed to us, actually.
Exactly. The host fucking emails me and I wish they would.
What is the number of people who listen to make this legitimate or like respectable or whatever weird concept you have? At the end of the day, you do it because you want to do it, and it brings you a sense of joy and fascination. And like, there's 10 people listening. That's really cool.
I mean, for today, my magic number is 3.
That's the joke I was going to make is more than the number of members in ZZ Top. So I'm going for 4, I guess.
So you're a little more ambitious than Jeff.
You made a couple of Learjet references, so I just want to point out that during the time that Foreigner was working on the Unusual Heat album, they were flying back and forth between, I think, New York and Los Angeles on Rolling Stone's jet. They were getting personal loan of Jan Winter's Rolling Stone jet, and magically the other statistic that is attached to that is somehow they wound up getting a 3.5-star review in Rolling Stone for this album. So do with that information what you will.
Very weird.
So also, I will say that like when you were saying like how, people just straight out like asking you like how much money you make. Like I always like, seeing like how far along in Google is somebody, like if I Google somebody's name, is it going to have that classic question, how much is so-and-so worth? Because so in this case, so I Googled Ben Arthur. And so the section that will deliver the gold results always is the people also ask section. So one of the things that sticks out in here is how high is Ben Arthur? Now, I already knew from looking at the couple things that come below that unfortunately this does not relate to the Ben Arthur that we know.
Yeah, the mountain.
Yeah, there's apparently a mountain. So apparently there's a Ben Arthur mountain that if we would have been aware of this, Jeff, like we really should have scaled the Ben Arthur mountain a long time ago, just in tribute to our good friend Ben.
But how high was he to agree to this podcast?
2,900 feet, I believe. So pretty high.
There was also a horse, and a prize-winning horse at some point in the distant past as well. And fascinatingly, an Australian rapper who tried to release his music as Ben Arthur as well.
Now, here's a YouTube description that's interesting to me. Let me see. I can just say that the description that comes up in Google is Ben Arthur provides simple style and grooming tips and guides for men. I'm assuming that's not your YouTube channel.
That is also out there. Yeah, there's also Ben and Arthur, which I think is a pornography video of some kind.
But lest I don't want to give people listening the wrong impression, Ben does in fact have his Google dialed in properly because the first thing that comes up, top results, is Ben Arthur songwriter. So you win. There you go.
Well, for you, like each person's Google results are different. A Scottish person would probably see something different in their results.
Stupid algorithms. Everybody should see your results when they get that.
I got to say how happy I am that you took this conversation in such a philosophical direction.
Absolutely.
It's more than this album deserves because as much as I agree with you that, sales does not equal quality, this record is objectively not great. But still, I think this is like the most fascinating conversation that anybody has ever had around Foreigner's Unusual Heat.
I like that he came armed with questions and a game, no less.
Yeah, and a game. We got to start playing games every episode.
Like he had thoughts, so I really like that.
I have enjoyed our conversation thoroughly, as I always do. Thank you for having me.
I think Matt was part of this conversation that I was part of earlier this week. We have a writer friend who was sort of lamenting that they can put all of this time and research into something, and then they publish it and nobody responds, and then they publish something that they didn't put any effort into, and it gets more of a response. And I was just sort of mystified that this guy was this upset about it, because I feel like anytime you venture to make art, that's a lesson that you have to learn relatively quickly, that you not only don't have control over it, but you kind of, whether consciously or not, you give up the right to have any say in how it's received. You got to do the thing because you want to do the thing, and then let that be enough. But man, that's fucking hard. That's a tough thing to do. I mean, when Pop Dose started, spun off of my a little blog, the whole notion that I had enough of an audience that people wanted to kind of back a venture like that was enough to just, it really impacted the way that I wrote and kind of screwed me up for a long time. And so I'm not joking. Like, I feel like introducing an audience to that equation, knowing that you're making whatever art you're making for people who are waiting for it, it's hard not to think about what they want, why they're paying attention to you, what you need to keep doing in order to hang on to that attention. It's rough.
Yeah, I brought this up earlier this week, and I think it applies to Ben as well. So I know that you saw this, but it's just like, one of the most important things that an editor gave me advice-wise that I've applied to so many different things that I've done since then was I asked the editor what the word count was for a piece that I needed to turn in. And he just wrote back, and this was the way that like he's worked the entire time that I've worked with him, but he said, write what you feel. And so I feel like whether you're a writer or a songwriter or whoever you are, like that's just such an important thing to learn, is that like at the end of the day, like you need to just write what you feel, like you have to stay true to yourself.
I've gotten lots of people ask me about stats, like, can I get the stats on my, and I'm like, I think every time I say beyond this place lie monsters, just don't, don't think about it. Don't look.
I was talking to an artist, Nicholson Baker, who reads in an upcoming episode of my pod. And he was saying, unless you're William Shakespeare and you're going to be taught sort of mechanically century over the century, no matter who you are, you're going to be forgotten almost instantly, like when you think of time in a large scale. And if you can accept that and not fight that and be humble in front of that, you can then understand that the work that you're doing is about that day, is about relieving the pressure. And, it's easy to say and harder to do, but the more that one can do that, I think the happier one can be. And this is the wild jujitsu of it, is that I think also your work will be that much better if you can let go of your expectations or the voices of other people in your head telling you how to please those people that you're imagining.
It was more thoughtful and poetic than any single line on Unusual Heat.
I appreciate that.
I'm so glad to have been here for it. We don't even need to ask the question, I don't think, but I'm going to ask it anyway. Do we think that this record was met with an appropriate level of success?
I don't think so, but it's just like anybody you talk to that was involved with the band doesn't seem surprised with how the level of success it did not find.
You sent me a transcript to a Johnny Edwards interview today. He described these songs as plodding and mediocre, which I thought was very funny from the guy who was supposed to sell the songs, to cop to that. I think bravo for him.
Yeah.
Ben, you agree? You think that this ended up where it should have ended up on the charts?
I mean, but isn't that question itself wrapped up in the other stuff that we were talking about? No. They made the record that they felt like making. They made the best possible record they could. And, the rest of the world reacted to it the way they reacted to it. It is not for me. I'll say that. This album is not for me. This art was not made for me. It's not what I love.
I really would have liked to have seen in an alternate universe what happens if, Mick Jones, who at this point has gotten a level of respect as a producer, what happens if he just takes the reins and produces this record on his own and they don't have Terry Thomas? I feel like there's meddling that we're not seeing here, whether it was Terry Thomas, label folks. Otherwise, I wonder if they would have made a better record if Mick just would have had the keys and just the ability to like move forward, put together his own team, which he did, and make the next chapter of Foreigner record.
I mean, at the end of the day, if the songs aren't there, like shit in, shit out. It doesn't matter like how much gold you wrap it in.
That's the thing, though, is it seems like Terry Thomas was pretty heavily involved in the songwriting process. All the songs are credited to Johnny, Mick, and Terry. So it's like, I think if you take the formulaic Terry out of the mix and force Mick to bring a little bit more of his A game to the party, like, I don't know, maybe the songs would have been worse.
Well, they were not all Johnny, Terry, and Mick. There was that one, Ready for the Rain, I think, was a song that Johnny brought to the table. I think that's an old song.
Correct. Yeah, he brought that from his previous band, Northrop.
Somehow Mick and Terry ended up with a co-write on that song.
Amazing how that happens, right? They were already practiced. They were already practiced at the art of writing their way onto a song to get the credit.
It was a little Colonel Tom Parker action ending on that song. But
change a word, take a third.
Yeah.
I can't remember who the artist was, but I heard it was a pretty big thing. And I heard it recently, where the artist was like, basically like, the guy said to me, this song needs another verse. And he's like, it doesn't need another verse. He's like, now I realize why he wanted to add a third verse. Because boom, he got the writing credit.
Apparently, Dolly Parton was offered the chance to have Elvis record "And I Will Always Love You," but they demanded half the publishing, and she said no.
Wow.
Good for her.
Yeah. I mean, and there maybe is an argument for the opposite of what we've been talking about, where something that extraordinary can somehow have a life of its own, over time. Who knows?
I figure if you, much like What Would Jesus Do, if you take that instead, what would Dolly do? I feel like if you apply a lot of, the what would Dolly do philosophy to life, it seems to work out pretty well.
She's really an extraordinary person.
She really is. Yeah, 100%.
And then the final question.
Yes.
Do we think that the way this album performed was a bellwether for what was about to happen at the format?
I don't think so. I don't know. I don't think that this thing made enough of a ripple in the water one way or another. I think this record definitely got eclipsed by, whether it's the Van Halen For Unlawful Carnal Knowledge record or any other, records from similar juggernaut bands that came out this year. This record, I think, arrived to what ends up being a pretty muted response. So I don't think so.
Ben is nodding thoughtfully.
I have zero thoughts on radio. Like I have nothing to add. I was nodding sagely.
I think we've said it all, really. I think we've said it all. So, Ben, tell people where they can find you, please.
Sure. BenArthur.com or songwriterpodcast.com. And I'm out there on the social medias too.
When will folks get to hear the David Gilmour, Polly Sampson chat? And when will folks get to hear the Amanda Shires chat?
That they're one after the other, July 27th and August 10th in Gilmour first, and then Amanda and George. And actually, I wrote a song in response to George's story as well, which is fun. Those are all going to be released at the same time.
Fantastic.
Well, this will go before that. So people need to keep it in their heads that it's coming.
Delightful. Dial me up on the Spotify. Add one or two listens to my terrible numbers. Gentlemen, what a pleasure to talk with you, always.
Likewise, Ben. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you.